Japan had spent months preparing for a full-scale Pacific invasion by the time the Pearl Harbor attack sparked the United States' entry into World War II. Japan's survival depended on the importation of natural resources and raw materials. For Japanese industry to operate, imports of rubber, tin, iron, and most importantly oil were necessary. The Japanese war machine also required the same basic ingredients. Japan took possession of the island of Formosa, a portion of Korea, and a small portion of Manchuria after defeating China in a brief war in 1894-1895. All of these territories' natural resources were also included. Following Japan's victory over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, the Empire of the Sun seized all of Korea and a portion of Manchuria that the Russians had previously occupied. Japan staged an incident at a train station on the Korean border of Manchuria on September 19, 1931, during a global slump, and used the incident as justification to invade the mineral-rich Chinese province. Japan left the League of Nations when the League denounced the act. Japan rejected the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, which had restricted the size of the Japanese Navy in order to increase the size of her Navy in 1936. Using the excuse that Chinese forces had opened fire on Japanese troops in Manchuria, Japan began a full-scale invasion of China in July 1937. Japan was unable to subjugate all of China, but by 1939 it controlled nearly all of the major port towns and had solid control over the raw materials entering and leaving the Asian powerhouse. When France was occupied by the Nazis in June 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina and the U.S., in order to prevent the shipment of strategic minerals and chemicals, aircraft engines, parts, and equipment to Japan. Congress created the Shipment Control Act. Crude oil was conspicuously missing from this list. When the Japanese joined the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in September 1940, the already tense relations between the United States and Japan deteriorated. Hitler hoped that the Tripartite Pact would incite Japan to invade British holdings in the Far East in order to encircle existing forces, as he was already preparing to launch a war in Europe. As they developed plans to invade and seize the lucrative oil fields of the Netherlands East Indies, the Japanese simultaneously thought that the pact would offer security. The United States placed further embargoes on iron, copper, and brass in reaction to the Tripartite Pact. However, President Franklin D. Roosevelt refrained from outright prohibiting Japanese oil sales. Japan promised that her back door was secure and closed by signing a 5-year non-aggression treaty with Russia in the spring of 1941. Japan then started to target the Netherlands East Indies and pushed more troops into French Indochina. Roosevelt responded to the military deployments by freezing all Japanese assets in the U.S. and, after much deliberation, imposing a crude oil embargo. The Dutch said that the Netherlands East Indies will also cease selling oil to Japan following the U.S. embargo. Japan first had to destroy the British bastion of Singapore, destroy American forces in the Philippines, and cripple the United States in order to take the Netherlands East Indies and seize its crucial oil fields. Pearl Harbor's Pacific Fleet. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Singapore, Hong Kong, Northern Malaya, Thailand, Guam, Wake Island, and Midway Atoll in a 24-hour period. They also started making plans to seize the island of Sumatra, which is east of Java, along with the nearby oil refineries and a vital airfield. The Japanese army started experimenting with airborne forces in December 1940. The first volunteers were trained in Ichigaya, which is close to Tokyo. The unit has strict requirements. Officers could not be older than 28, and the majority of volunteers were in the 20 to 25 age range. Everyone underwent a rigorous medical examination. In addition to additional psychological and physical testing, volunteers received rigorous physical fitness training akin to that of a gymnast, because it was believed that paratroopers needed to possess feline-like skills in order to land safely. Training shifted to an entertainment park in Tokyo, with a unique attraction that featured a 165-foot parachute drop after roughly 250 individuals were chosen. Thrill seekers were tied to a canopy that was raised by cable before being released to float to the ground. according to historians Gordon Rotman and Akira Takezawa. In order to experience a few simulated descents, trainees were instructed to visit the park while posing as university students because the paratroop unit's existence was secret. Other training included somersaults and tumbling, jumping from different heights to learn landing techniques, and, lastly, actual jumps from moving planes. The initial volunteer group was divided into cadres to accommodate new trainees after it had received adequate training. Colonel Seiichi Kumei's 1st Raiding Brigade, which included the 1st Raiding Regiment, Major Takeo Takeda, the 2nd Raiding Regiment, Major Takeo Kimura, and the 1st Raiding Brigade headquarters, was formed by January 1942 when the Army had enough paratroopers trained. In order to give the paratroopers their own autonomous airplane group, the brigade was also assigned to the 1st Raiding Flying Regiment, Major Akihito Nihara, an air transport group. Instead of the 3,800 members of a typical infantry regiment, each regiment had just roughly 700 men, 3 rifle companies, an engineer company, and a regimental headquarters group were all part of each regiment. By late December 1941, the Army had actually finished preparing for the parachute drop on Sumatra. However, on January 3, 1942, an unintentional fire on board the cargo ship Mako Maru, which was carrying the 1st Raiding Regiment to an airfield on the Malay Peninsula, forced the paratroopers to abandon the ship without their parachutes, gear, or weapons. The paratroopers were too worn out and bruised by their terrifying experience to perform a combat parachute drop, while stranded on Hainan Island off the northern coast of French Indochina. The Imperial Army General Staff resorted to Major Kimura and his 2nd Raiding Regiment after learning of the catastrophe. About 450 paratroopers drew parachutes, weapons, and equipment, but the unit was still being organized. The understrength 2nd Raiding Regiment departed Kyushu on January 15th and reached Phnom Penh, Cambodia on February 2nd. For the air attacks against the oil refineries and Palembang airfield, the 2nd Raiding Regiment was divided into the 1st and 2nd attack groups. On February 14th, the 1st Raiding Flying Regiments Tachikawa, Type LO, Thelma, and Mitsubishi Ki-57 Type 100 Model 1. Topsy aircraft would drop the 1st attack group, which had roughly 350 officers and troops in it. The 12th Transport Chutai would drop the 2nd attack group, which had just 90 troops and officers a day later. The 98th Sentai would mysteriously drop the tiny cargo containers with the weapons, machine guns, ammunition, and other supplies from 27 twin-engine Mitsubishi Type 97 Sally medium bombers. The paratroopers were concerned about this idea. Historians Rotman and Takezawa noted that the paratroopers on the ground would be forced to fight a well-armed enemy with only pistols and grenades if the containers were misdropped or delayed. Nakajima Ki-43, Oscar fighter aircraft from the 59th and 64th Sentai, were to accompany both missions. 9 Kawasaki Ki-48, Type 99, Lily light bombers from the 90th Sentai will also drop anti-personnel bombs across the Dutch airfield prior to the initial drop. The entire attack force had shifted from Cambodia to the west side of the Malay Peninsula by February 13th. The 2nd attack group had moved to Sungai Petani, while the 1st attack group had assembled at the recently taken Allied airfields at Keluang and Kahang. The commanders and men toasted one another with sake as they got ready for their early morning drop at Palembang, Sumatra's capital. Situated on the Moesi River, approximately 50 miles inland from the Bangka Strait, Palembang was home to almost 28,000 people. Its oil fields were regarded as the best in Southeast Asia. On the south bank of the Moesi River, around 4 miles east of the town, 2 oil refineries had been built. The 2 refineries were separated by the Komering River, a branch of the Moesi. The Standard Oil Company's refinery, Nederlandse Koloniale Petroleum Maatschappij, NKPM, was located on the east bank and the furthest from Palembang. The Shell Oil-owned Batavia Petroleum Maatschappij, BPM, was located on the west bank. The latter refinery was constructed as 2 distinct sites, one on the south bank of the Moesi River and one across from the NKPM refinery on the west bank of the Komering River. The Dutch did not want to destroy the facilities too soon, even though they may have predicted that the Japanese would want the two refineries intact. There was a newly built military airfield, Moesi, P2, 40 miles to the south of Palembang, in addition to the well-known civilian airfield, Pangkalan Benteng, P1, located 8 miles north. P1 featured a control tower, barracks buildings, and a firm concrete runway that had been utilized by civilian aircraft for years. Unfortunately for the Dutch, the Japanese were familiar with P1. Nevertheless, the recently created P2 included a deftly hidden dirt runway that could conceal Allied aircraft beneath the surrounding forest canopy. Due to its well-hidden location, the Japanese were unaware of P2. Palembang was selected as the headquarters of the British Royal Air Force, RAF, on Sumatra. As the Japanese approached in mid-January, the RAF established 6 fighter and bomber squadrons at P1 and P2. The British pilots conducted dozens of sorties against the Japanese, who were swiftly advancing in the area using the high-octane aviation fuel generated at the 2 refineries. Lieutenant Col LNW Vogelesang of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, KNIL, Territorial Command. Dutch Sumatra commanded the entire region surrounding Palembang. The South Sumatra Garrison Battalion, with 110 troops and 2 vintage armored vehicles, garrisoned P1. There were more airmen than airplanes at P1 because Japanese aircraft were shooting up more planes on the ground than people. A temporary ground defense force was then established, consisting of 72 grounded airmen from the Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF, and 3 officers from the RAF. Regretfully, these troops lacked the right equipment and sufficient riflemanship training. Colonel Vogelesang commanded 8 stationary 75mm field cannons and 1 Staatswacht was Landstorm, Home Guard Reserve, infantry company in the town of Palembang. At the oil refineries was a company of KNIL regulars with machine guns, before 2 batteries of the 6th Heavy AA Regiment, Royal Artillery, and 1 battery of the 35th Light AA Regiment, Royal Artillery, with 16 heavy 3.7-inch AA guns and 16 40mm Bofors AA guns, respectively, arrived from Singapore on February 2nd. Vogelesang had no anti-aircraft guns to defend the airfields and refineries. P1 received a troop of roughly 150 troops from the heavy anti-aircraft battery, together with 6 Bofors and 6 3.7-inch guns. 6 3.7-inch and 6 Bofors guns were moved to P2, along with a battery from the 6th Regiment and the light anti-aircraft battery. The refineries were guarded by a final troop that included the 4 3.7-inch and 4 Bofors guns that were left. Unfortunately, the 2 regiments' ability to engage the enemy was limited when the ship that carried the majority of the ammunition for the anti-aircraft guns was sunk. Colonel Vogelesang had 1 Royal Netherlands Navy mine layer, the HNLMS Pro Patria, and 2 patrol boats, the P-38 and P-40, to help protect the Palembang riverfront and the refinery docks. With orders to oppose any Japanese attempt to proceed up the river to Palembang, the 3 ships guarded the Moesi River continuously. The Dutch, British, and indigenous defenders had nothing to do but wait since everything was ready. The 2nd Raiding Regiment was supposed to seize the 2 refineries and P1, the only known airport, according to the Japanese strategy. The Japanese sought to take control of the refineries without destroying them. As a result, 180 men, including the 4th Rifle Company, 97 men under Lieutenant Mitsuya, Signal Unit, 30 men under Lieutenant Komaki, 3rd Platoon, 2nd Rifle Company, 36 men under Lieutenant Mizuno, and 2nd Raiding Regiment Headquarters Group, as 17 men under Major Kimura, would land 3/4 of a mile southeast of the airfield. The 1st and 2nd platoons of the 2nd Rifle Company, which consisted of 60 troops under the command of Lieutenant Nobutaka Hirose, would land 1/8 of a mile west of P1. The 2 units, 240 men, would advance, encircle, and take control of the airfield once they were on the ground. The 1st and 2nd platoons of the 1st Rifle Company, which consisted of 60 soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Kikuo Nakao, were scheduled to be dropped a third of a mile west of the Shell Oil BPM facilities on the west bank of the Komering River at the same time, almost half a mile south of the Standard Oil NKPM complex on the east side of the Komering. The 3rd Platoon, 1st Rifle Company, 39 troops under Lieutenant Hasebi would land at the same time. Colonel Kume and a few members of his staff would crash land a transport between the airstrip and Palembang once the full 1st attack group was on the ground. It would have a 37mm anti-tank gun inside. The plan was for the paratroopers to rush ahead, take control of the airfield and both oil installations, and hold out until reinforcement battalions arrived by water and moved up the Moesi River to relieve them. The 229th Infantry Regiment and 1 battalion from the 230th Infantry Regiment, both from the 38th Infantry Division, would make an amphibious landing to provide reinforcements for the understrength parachute regiment. The infantrymen were to land on barges at the mouth of the Moesi River and then charge upriver to Palembang as planned. The only immediate reinforcements for the paratroopers would come from the 2nd Attack Force, which consisted of 90 men under Lieutenant Ryo Morisawa from the 3rd Company until they arrived, which was anticipated to take 2 days. On the 2nd day, these few guys were supposed to be parachuted onto P1. Even so, it would be difficult for the 2nd Raiding Regiment to maintain its designated targets until the infantry arrived. A British spy aircraft saw the invasion convoy north of Bangka Island on February 10th, and made the accurate estimate that it was en route to Palembang. The British bombed the Japanese ships several times throughout the course of the following days and nights, and by February 14th, the Dutch, British, and local Sumatrans in the Palembang area were fully aware of the Japanese's plan. The sole operational aircraft at P1, 15 Hawker Hurricane fighters, took out at early light to accompany a few flights of RAF bombers from P2 in their strikes on the rapidly approaching Japanese convoy. Around 8:30 a.m., the transports carrying the paratroopers from the 2nd Raiding Regiment started to leave the Malay airfields. For the air assault on Sumatra, a total of 150 aircraft were en route. An Allied observation post detected the Japanese while the flight was still 100 miles from Palembang, and word was sent to P1 right once. As soon as possible, Air Commander S.F. Vincent, who was in charge of one of the RAF squadrons at P1, ordered that rifles and ammunition be issued forthwith, warning the airfield defense officer to expect a paratroop assault. Regretfully, there weren't enough firearms for the RAF members to distribute. In reality, only perhaps 60 airmen were armed and positioned to assist the 200 KNIL regulars in defending the airstrip. The Japanese planes arrived at the entrance of the Moesi River around 11:20 a.m., about 3 hours after they had taken off. Never deviating from their original course, the planes glided silently past the departing British bombers, following the river and heading nearly due south. The British anti-aircraft cannons at the airfield and the oil refineries started fire as the Japanese aircraft approached both targets. One soldier was killed instantly, and multiple others were wounded when a shell exploded in the breech of one of the Bofor's anti-aircraft guns. The Japanese aircraft started strafing the area after the 90th Sentai bombers had covered the barracks buildings and the runway. At 11:26 a.m., 18 transports flew in at roughly 600 feet and started dropping Major Kimura's 180 paratroopers southeast of the airstrip, while the aircraft and bombers were engaged directly over it. 6 further transports started dumping the 60 troops from the 2nd Rifle Company's 1st and 2nd platoons west of the airstrip at around the same moment. Suddenly, above the airstrip, came a flight of 15 Hurricanes and a few Lockheed Hudson bombers that had recently attacked the Japanese invasion convoy in the north. The British pilots saw the Germans below them as they flew in high through heavy clouds. Despite having little fuel, the fighters launched an instant attack on P2 as the bombers continued their approach. Pilot Officer Bill Lockwood and his wingman emerged from the clouds and headed for the leading sally. Lockwood swooped quickly and shot up the bomber that was transporting part of the cargo crates. Lockwood and his wingman leveled out and sprinted directly into a raging downpour as they pulled up abruptly. They had already left the airfield by the time they emerged, and they had to return to Palembang by following the Moesi River. As Lockwood approached P1 for the second time, he noticed several white objects on the ground and assumed that Japanese paratroopers were engaged in combat. Lockwood and his wingman flew on to P2 when he noticed a red, very flare shot from P1, warning him not to land. About 2 kilometers from P1, the party of paratroopers was dropped into a tiny tree-covered region southeast of the airfield. With supplies dispersed and some troops carrying only a handgun and hand grenades from the drop, the haphazard paratroopers started to move toward the airstrip in small, isolated groups. Originally scheduled to land at the southeast drop zone, a plane load of paratroopers from the 4th Rifle Company, led by Lieutenant Minoru Okamoto, were unable to exit their aircraft in time due to a clogged door. Rather, the paratroopers landed close to the main road that connected Palembang to the airfield, more than 4 miles south of the drop zone. With only pistols and grenades, Okamoto immediately gathered the 4 other soldiers he could find and started heading north down the route to P1. They severed the telephone connections between the town and the airfield while they were in transit. Although aerial images had shown the terrain to be level and covered with low grasses, the 60 soldiers of the 1st and 2nd platoons, as 2nd Rifle Company under Lieutenant Hirose, descended in dense, 6-foot-high reeds west of the airstrip. Small groups of paratroopers, once more armed only with hand grenades and handguns, started moving east toward the airfield after failing to locate their supply crates. Lieutenant Hirose continued toward P1, but he was only able to find 2 other men. The Dutch and British troops dug in, refusing to give the Japanese attacking planes even an inch of space when they eventually took off. Browning machine guns were taken from unusable aircraft and placed on earthen mounds by ground and air crew members who had not received firearms. The Bofors and 3.7-inch anti-aircraft teams leveled their weapons and started firing horizontally over open sights at the same moment. The defenders engaged the few Japanese who made it to the airfield for the next hour or so. Many of the paratroopers arrived in tiny groups or in singles or pairs, widely dispersed by the drop. Some reportedly took their rifles from the strewn-about cargo containers, then went into trees on the airfield's south side and started shooting at the personnel of the anti-aircraft guns. Once the snipers were scattered, the airfield fell eerily silent. The majority of the paratroopers had landed many miles from the field and were struggling to assemble, collect their belongings, and move toward P1. A group of Dutch officers, who had been unable to get to headquarters at Palembang due to the damaged telephone wires, decided to give up and started dragging the 200 widely dispersed defenders out of P1 after spotting that the jig was up and taking advantage of the quiet before the anticipated storm. The British artillerymen started removing their anti-aircraft guns, as some of the men were preparing to destroy the unusable planes, and others were getting ready to burn a stack of 44-gallon barrels of aviation fuel. Unfortunately, only 2 guns could be transferred, because there was only 1 prime mover vehicle available. 2 crews started transporting the 2 3.7-inch anti-aircraft weapons that were left after destroying the other 2, while the majority of the crews headed down the road to Palembang. Even though a few carloads of retiring officers and men were able to escape from P1 by using the main road that led south to Palembang, Lieutenant Okamoto and his small group of men, who had been dropped far south of the airfield due to the jammed door, soon began firing upon the other vehicles. Now that he had roughly 20 men, Okamoto waited in ambush around a bend in the road 4 miles south of the airstrip. Soon after, a 6-wheel truck arrived and was hit by hand grenades and pistol fire, which managed to topple the vehicle and establish a blockade. Johnny Johnson, RAF, was driving the following car down the road when Okamoto's men rushed him as he approached the corner and saw the overturned truck. Johnson reportedly hit at least 2 paratroopers with a handgun he fired from a roadside ditch after escaping his car, but he eventually ran out of ammunition and was forced to surrender. Then, apparently to stop Johnson from escaping, the Japanese commander took away his revolver and shot him in the thigh. Then, just when it appeared that the other paratroopers would murder him, a second car was heard coming from P1's direction. The Japanese dispersed into the ditches beside the road, and when the car was in sight, they started fire with Johnson in tow. The car, which was packed with RAF men, was rocked by hand grenades and struck by pistol fire before toppling over and contributing to the spontaneous blockage. At least 4 RAF troops were wounded and taken prisoner, while a handful were murdered. The Japanese paratroopers swiftly fired and killed all 4. The evacuation from P1 was well under progress by the time the next few vehicles arrived at the roadblock. A fuel tanker was among the vehicles that failed to safely pass past the expanding blockade, but one car did. The fuel truck tipped onto its side after skidding out of control after being hit by hand grenades. The truck did not explode, but it did put another impediment in the middle of the road and trapped one man underneath. Men from the other trucks jumped out and took refuge in the ditches beside the road or in the bush. The few armed evacuees started shooting back at the Japanese. In the meantime, the Dutch troops in Palembang were attempting to arrange for P1 reinforcements. Air Commander S.F. Vincent and his driver gathered 3 truckloads of Dutch troops and an RAF van loaded with food, then hopped into their own car and drove the convoy north toward P1. About 9 miles later, they rounded a bend in the road and collided with the enemy roadblock. They were immediately fired upon. Without firing a shot, the other trucks quickly turned around and went back to Palembang, even if the van carrying the food supplies wound up in a ditch. Commander Vincent wrote, "I felt ashamed and disgusted." When 2 armored cars and 4 army trucks with roughly 150 Dutch soldiers neared the makeshift barrier from Palembang at midday, another attempt was made to reinforce the airfield. Lieutenant Okamoto was now being reinforced by additional Japanese paratroopers who had emerged from the woods. The Japanese launched a barrage of grenades, pistol fire, and fire from captured firearms as the Dutch convoy approached the overturned fuel tanker. With the exception of 1 truckload of soldiers and 1 crew of armored cars, the majority of the KNIL soldiers were caught completely off guard and retreated back into town after abandoning their vehicles. Lieutenant Okamoto was injured and 2 Japanese paratroopers were killed in the resulting combat. Nevertheless, the Japanese were able to hold the roadblock, drive out the surviving Dutch, and seize the armored vehicle. Major Kimura, who had been dropped southeast, arrived at the roadblock just after 1:30 p.m. with roughly 25 members of the 4th Rifle Company. In order to prevent reinforcements from heading north from Palembang, or to apprehend any evacuees escaping south from P1, Kimura determined that the roadblock should be kept in place. While he positioned the remainder of his troops to guard the roadblock, Kimura used the stolen armored car to send Lieutenant Uki and 20 men north along the road toward P1 to seize the Dutch airfield office, which was located around a mile south of the airdrome. As scheduled, shortly after the other paratroopers landed, Colonel Coombs' transport, which included his staff, a 37mm anti-tank gun, and crew, crashed several miles southeast of P1. Regretfully, the aircraft crashed in a damp forest. Kume would spend a restless night attempting to escape the muck as he was buried, soaked, attacked by mosquitoes, and separated from the majority of his soldiers. Only 3 miles into their advance into P1, Lieutenant Uki and his troop of armored cars encountered 300 British airmen and Dutch soldiers who were escaping the airfield. P1's evacuation was now fully under progress. The Japanese paratroopers startled the escaping men and started to push them back by firing with the side weapons and the captured armored car. Groups of additional paratroopers, some from the western group and some from the southeast group, eventually arrived at the airstrip and began the assault about the same time. Lieutenant Gamo of the 2nd Rifle Company had gathered 16 men on the west side and was pushing east toward the airdrome. When the guys eventually arrived to the edge of the airfield, they attacked without hesitation, despite having just handguns and grenades. Lieutenant Gamo spotted a British anti-aircraft station and hurled a grenade before running forward. He was slain nearly immediately. Undaunted, the remaining paratroopers persisted in their assault, albeit a little more carefully than their commander. Around 2 p.m., Lieutenant Hiros, the commander of the 2nd Rifle Company, and the 2 soldiers he could locate arrived to the airstrip. Hiros and his men were cautiously making their way toward a Dutch barracks when they unexpectedly spotted roughly 300 Dutch soldiers, possibly the same guys that Lieutenant Uki and his company of armored cars were attacking. Being vastly outnumbered, Hiros prudently withdrew his 2 men and crept into the nearby jungle. Things had heated up once more at the barricade. The roadblock had been approached by Dutch forces and armed RAF men from Palembang, who parked their vehicles and proceeded to confront the enemy on foot. The Allied troops started sniping at the men of Major Kimura and Lieutenant Okamoto as they crept up through the undergrowth until they could see the Japanese. At the same moment, a small gang began to approach with the intention of burning the overturned fuel truck. A few injured Allied soldiers alerted the men as they approached the truck that a surviving RAF man was still trapped beneath it. As they debated their options, enemy machine gun fire started to rip apart the trees and Japanese mortar rounds started to fall all around them. The group made the snap decision to abandon their goal and run into a neighboring swamp. Major Kimura and the others were eventually driven out of the roadblock by the Dutch and RAF riflemen who had gained the upper hand. Unfortunately for the RAF trooper stuck beneath the fuel tanker, they arrived too late. He had long already passed away by the time the rescue crew arrived. Lieutenant Uki's 20 paratroopers and the stolen armored car had successfully driven the 300 Dutch and RAF defenders away and taken control of the airfield office by 6 p.m. Uki sent the armored car back toward the barrier to report his success to Major Kimura, who took the remainder of his soldiers north toward the airfield, leaving a few men to protect the office. The captured armored car emerged out of nowhere as Flying Officer McNamara, who had managed to escape from P1, and the others milled about at the barrier. The Allied riflemen immediately realized that the car was in Japanese hands and opened fire, causing the driver to crash into the other vehicles of the roadblock. We naturally thought that the Dutch had at last broken through to our relief, McNamara recalled, but after many had revealed themselves from the side of the road, they were greeted with hand grenades. Knowing their game was up, the Japanese attempted to break free, but were met with a barrage of small arms fire from rifles and revolvers as they emerged from the turret, McNamara added. The captured airfield office and the 4 or 5 Japanese paratroopers who had been left to protect it were shortly discovered by a small group of armed British airmen who were heading toward P1, possibly sensing that the airfield might be under Japanese control. After that, there was a protracted engagement until roughly 20 Dutch reinforcements, one of whom had a Bren gun, arrived and assisted in taking the fiercely fought strongpoint. Meanwhile, the paratroopers kept coming in from their dispersed drop zones and fighting the defenders at the airstrip. The majority of the Allied defenders had either been killed or evacuated from the airfield by late afternoon. There were only a few of Dutch soldiers and around 60 armed RAF men left. They held on obstinately despite the fact that their ammunition was getting low. The RAF ground crew were ready for them, and the RAF lads stuck to their posts mowing down the Japs as they landed, remembered RAF ground crewman Leslie Baker. The RAF alone, we did. We killed quite a few of the Japanese parachutists before we were able to clean them up. Our aerodrome was a shambles because of it. Before it was hit by Japanese fire, the prime mover vehicle that had been trying to evacuate 2 3.7-inch anti-aircraft weapons arrived at the main route to Palembang. Unfortunately, a U.S., according to an Army historian, one of these guns had to be abandoned on the way, since light machine gun fire had riddled the tires. In actuality, none of the anti-aircraft guns managed to leave P1. The paratroopers secured all 12 guns, the majority of which had been disabled by their crews. Wing Commander H.J. Maguire and Platoon Officer O.D. Cregan believed they heard troops on the way to Palembang during a brief pause in the combat and rushed down the road to meet them, supposing they were Dutch reinforcements. Rather, they encountered 60-70 Japanese soldiers gathering in the street. Maguire and Cregan made the decision to bluff their way out, since they knew they couldn't defeat the enemy on their own. After putting down their weapons, the 2 officers approached the closest Japanese soldier. Maguire remembered he looked really surprised but did nothing. To my surprise, he shambled off and produced an officer after I demanded to see him, sounding as assertive as possible. This officer could speak a little English, so I requested surrender right away, claiming to have a sizable force behind me. He responded that he had a sizable force and that he would provide us with safe conduct if we marched out. Maguire and Cregan continued their bluff by stating that they would need to speak with their non-existent senior officer about the Allied command's potential surrender before turning around and returning to their guns, picking them up, and making their way calmly back to the airfield. Upon reaching Peeve 1, the two officers found that the few troops who were still there had used the pause in combat to destroy the remnants of a few unusable planes and set the fuel dump on fire. The about 60 staunch defenders then made a swift retreat north, using the route to Jambi, utilizing the few trucks that were left. Cregan and Maguire came right behind. P1 was totally empty of Allied troops by 5 p.m. The barracks that Lieutenant Heroes and his 3 men had previously approached was absolutely empty when they eventually emerged from hiding on the west side of the airstrip. They had just rice wafers and dry compressed fish with them, and they had been unable to find their drop containers, so it was a lucky coincidence that they discovered prepared rations still on the stove. Major Komura, who had been assembling small groups of paratroopers into larger units all day, eventually made it to the airfield an hour later. There was silence. All the Allies had been murdered or had escaped. By nightfall, P1 was under the control of about 100 2nd Rating Regiment Army paratroopers. Lieutenant Nakau and his 60 men from the 1st and 2nd platoons, 1st Rifle Company, were dropped by 6 Thelma transports on the west side of the Komering River near the Shell Oil BPM facilities at 11:30 a.m. on February 14, 1942. 6 minutes after the paratroopers started landing on P1. Around the same time, the 3 Thelmas carrying Lieutenant Hasibi and his 39 paratroopers from the 1st Rifle Company's 3rd Platoon started dropping the men south of the Standard Oil NKPM complex on the east side of the Komering. All of the transports were unharmed, despite the fact that the oil refinery's 3.7-inch and Bofors anti-aircraft guns fired on the aircraft. 9 cargo-carrying Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers were shot out of the sky. Lieutenant Nakau's men landed in a shallow wetland and found their guns and supplies with no trouble, in contrast to the paratroopers at P1, who had to locate their cargo containers among tall, reedy grass or jungle trees. One platoon leader, Lieutenant Tokunaga, led a party of 6 soldiers that overran a pillbox at the southwest corner of the BPM refinery, making rapid progress toward the nearest portion of the plant near the confluence of the Moesi and Komering rivers. The 7 men proceeded into the residential part of the refinery before encountering roughly 60 Dutch soldiers with machine guns. As soon as possible, Tokunaga and his men took cover and started shooting. Lieutenants Ogawa and Yoshioka were assembling units of dispersed troops, while Lieutenant Tokunaga pushed into the refinery. The paratroopers pursued Lieutenant Tokunaga and caught up to him during the combat in the residential area, after sufficient personnel were available. Ogawa and Yoshioka led a group of perhaps a dozen soldiers to the summit of the central topping tower, where they raised the rising sun flag 2 hours after landing, sometime between 1:10 and 1:50 p.m., while Tokunaga kept the Dutch occupied. When the Japanese flag was raised, Lieutenant Tokunaga and the paratroopers, later joined by Lieutenant Nakau, commander of the 1st Rifle Company, down below started to move for the center topmost tower. When they first spotted the paratroopers coming down, they quickly cranked cranks, closed valves, and cleared demolition charges that the Dutch had put in place. The Dutch and British had amassed enough men to launch a counterattack by the time the Japanese hoisted the flag over the topmost tower. The Japanese paratroopers put up a fierce fight, using the air raid shelters from the oil refinery as pillboxes. Throughout the property, fighting broke out, with fighters occasionally separated by just 50 yards. Bullets pierced fuel pipes, causing thick black crude oil to flow forth. Black smoke billowed over the afternoon sky as the entire region erupted into flames when an Allied mortar shell struck some of the oil that had spilled. Commander Nakau, probably intending to gain a foothold in the isolated section of the BPM refinery along the Moesi River, instructed Lieutenant Tokunaga to lead his platoon and advance northward across the refinery, determined to cling on to their hard-earned prize as the sun started to set. Tokunaga fought valiantly, but they lost a number of troops and were only able to advance a short distance. The majority of the BPM refinery had been retaken by the Dutch and British soldiers by the time nightfall arrived, and the region was shrouded in strange shadows from the bright orange flames of the oil fires. However, a few members of the 2nd Rating Regiment and the 1st and 2nd Platoons of the 1st Rifle Company remained alive. Allied demolition squads discovered that they were unable to completely demolish the places they desired, because the paratroopers were clinging to important portions of the factories. The Dutch and British forces, unable to demolish the facility, silently withdrew into the night. Lieutenant Hasibi's 3rd Platoon, 1st Rifle Company, had landed south of the Standard Oil NKPM complex in a dense marsh on the east bank of the Komering River. 2 guys landed in front of a Dutch gun position with little more than their pistols and a few hand grenades. The 2 soldiers attacked, removing their concealing smocks and parachute harnesses, killing 8 stunned defenders. They climbed out of the marsh and continued on, finding a road that led directly to the refinery. However, the defenders opened fire as they approached, wounding one of the guys. The 2 attackers withdrew down the road to wait for the remainder of the 3rd Platoon, assisted by his friend. In the meantime, Lieutenant Hasibi was able to rapidly gather his battalion and their cargo containers after he was able to secure a native boat. As soon as they reached the road that led to the oil refinery through the marsh, Hasibi knew it would be a death zone. Hasibi was forced to attempt to hurry up the perilous road since she was unable to navigate the marsh. Hasibi and his troops piled out of the swamp and raced toward the oil refinery's front gate, getting within 100 yards when enemy fire killed Hasibi and several others. The Japanese invasion stagnated without a leader. Sergeant Tanba took command, canceled the frontal attack, and escorted the remaining soldiers back into the swamp with the hopes of advancing once more in the dark. Tanba and his paratroopers moved cautiously forward at 11 p.m., when nightfall finally arrived, and the only source of light was the flaming BPM refinery across the Komering River. They were shocked to discover the entire facility empty. Under the shadow of the night, the NKPM defenders had escaped. While waiting for reinforcements, the paratroopers at P1 and the 2 oil refineries continued to consolidate their gains throughout the night. On February 15, 1942, at first light, Japanese soldiers from the 38th Infantry Division's 229th Infantry Regiment started to disembark from the transport ships that had migrated up the Moesi River Delta. Dutch and British jets had repeatedly attacked the escort planes hovering over the ships, but they had repelled the onslaught. The covering task force sailed back out to sea to battle a convergent Allied task force as the men scrambled into landing barges that were waiting to go up the river. The RAF and ERAAF emerged to meet the barges and a few supporting vessels as they headed south down the Moesi River toward Palembang. Japanese fighters were constantly there to attempt to intercept the barges, but the 2 air forces repeatedly attacked them throughout the day. 20 barges are thought to have been sunk, but there were simply too many of them. Ultimately, the pilots of the RAF and RAAF were told to leave Sumatra and head to Java. All night long, there had been an evacuation at Palembang. The Japanese still controlled the airfield and maintained outposts and snipers along the Komering road, even though the barricade near P1 had finally been removed. The Dutch had set up their own roadblock on the road to the airstrip not far from Palembang, with the intention of preventing the Japanese paratroopers from making an unexpected rush into the city. Both military and civilian workers departed Palembang during the night and the following day. They burned anything they couldn't take before being transported across the Moesi to a train station and a secure road on the river's south bank. The evacuees saw a dense black cloud of smoke looming over the city at morning, a clear sign of the burning buildings in the BPM oil refinery. The remaining Japanese paratroopers spent the entire night at the 2 refineries listening to the Palembang evacuation. Then, at around 6 in the morning, a Dutch demolition charge that had been delayed exploded at the NKPM refinery. Now that Sergeant Tanba and his small group of 3rd Platoon, 1st Rifle Company paratroopers, were unable to stop more explosions and the spread of the ensuing fire, they understood why the complex had been abandoned entirely. Approximately 80% of the Standard Oil NKPM facility was ultimately destroyed. Everything at P1 was comparatively peaceful for the majority of the February 15th morning. Then, at 10:30 a.m., a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft from Malaya's Keluang airfield abruptly descended and touched down on the concrete runway. Major Kimura told the pilot right away that his men were fighting with either pistols or captured weapons, both of which were low on ammo, and that even though the airfield was in Japanese hands, the majority of the cargo containers had been lost during the airdrop. the daring pilot returned to Kailwang immediately. Since all of the 2nd Raiding Regiment's radios had been destroyed, along with their cargo containers, his report was the first indication that the combat drop on P1 had been effective. In a matter of minutes, more ammo and weapons were added to the 1 p.m. reinforcing parachute drop. Colonel Kume, stung by mosquitoes, and his small group of employees eventually emerged from the damp forest and headed to P1 at around noon. He was very pleased with the advancements made during his absence. The planes of the 2nd Attack Group, the reinforcing paratroop drop, arrived over the Palembang airfield exactly as planned an hour later. The 12th Transport Chutai's Thelmus started dropping Lieutenant Morisawa's 3rd Rifle Company's 90 soldiers straight onto the occupied airstrip, while the Oscar fighters from the 59th and 64th Sentai flew combat patrol overhead. The 98th Sentai crews started dumping scores of cargo containers from their Betty bombers, not far behind. Colonel Kume sent a platoon led by Lieutenant Adachi in the direction of Palembang after the 2nd airdrop was completed, and the valuable weapons and ammunition had been dispersed. The paratroopers quietly moved past the quickly abandoned Dutch roadblock and their own roadblock following the main route. When they arrived in the capital at 5:30 p.m., they saw that Palembang was on fire and the town was undefended. The men happened upon the 2 Dutch patrol boats, the P-39 and the P-40, while moving down to the river to check for the barges of the 229th Infantry Regiment. One of the boats was soon crippled, but the other one ran upriver. Lieutenant Adachi informed Colonel Kume that Palembang was unsecured, and Colonel Kume gave Lieutenant Morisawa the order to secure the town by leading his recently dropped 3rd Rifle Company into Palembang. Lieutenant Morisawa had communicated with the soldiers occupying the 2 oil refineries by the early hours of the evening. The landing barges carrying the 229th Infantry Regiment eventually arrived in Palembang that evening, February 15th, under the cover of darkness. The 2nd Raiding Regiment's Army paratroopers were waiting there to welcome them. 5 days later, the 38th Infantry Division took over the capital of Sumatra from the proud paratroopers. Once everything was in order, the 2nd Raiding Regiment went over the previous few days. In addition to capturing 23 anti-aircraft weapons, multiple armored vehicles, and a large number of trucks, the paratroopers said that they had killed 1,080 Dutch and RAF defenders. These numbers are obviously greatly inflated. However, the Japanese acknowledged that 2 transport planes were crash-landed, one on purpose, and 1 medium bomber was shot down during the first combat drop, either by Pilot Officer Lockwood or by anti-aircraft fire. Roughly 23% of the 339 paratroopers dropped were killed, 2 perished from parachute malfunction, critically injured, 37, and mildly wounded, 11. Historians have classified the 2nd Raiding Regiment's raid on P1 and the 2 oil refineries as both successful and unsuccessful. The United States released a brief intelligence report in October 1942, Army that declared the assault unsuccessful. The Japanese jumped from about 70 transport planes, according to the story, which is a glaring exaggeration. A total of about 300 attacked defending troops at the airdrome, and about 400 sought to capture the refineries, the report went on to say. With the exception of one group that was able to hold one of the refineries and stop it from being destroyed, almost all of the parachutists were killed or captured. The Dutch destroyed the other refinery. Overall, the operation was a failure. 2 more Army assessments, one from 1942 and another from 1945, reiterated that the attack had not succeeded in seizing the oil refineries undamaged and continued to exaggerate the number of Japanese attackers. But as time passed, historians started researching the incident and fixing the majority of the errors. Japanese tankers were quickly returning to their home islands with the essential refined oil. Despite their triumph, there was no further fighting on Sumatra for the Army paratroopers. With the aid of Japanese planes and bombers operating off of P1, the 38th Infantry Division persisted in its advance across southern Sumatra, securing a large portion of the island by February 24th. The majority of the remaining Dutch defenders had retreated to the northwest of the island by early March and were fighting a guerrilla war. About 2,000 Dutch soldiers turned themselves in to the 38th Infantry Division on March 28, 1942. The Japanese held the island of Sumatra firmly. In Bensenville, Illinois, Jean Eric Saliker, a retired university police officer, teaches social studies to 8th graders. He lives in River Grove, Illinois, and is the author of 4 books, including Blossoming Silk Against the Rising Sun, U.S. and Japanese Paratroopers in the Pacific in World War II,